Lord be with you. So I've got one quick announcement before we start, and that's, do we need some more chairs? There are some chairs back there that's folded up. Front row's open, that's right. Although we busy players know no one likes the front row. A little too close, right? A little too close to the action, but feel free if you like. Yeah. What's that?
This is the A students.
Yeah, the A students, that's right, that's right. Or the A professors. Yeah, you know. The B professors, maybe, no. But what's that? So we are going to make a slight change based on popular demand to our pub theology night. I'm sorry that I was sick in December, and then in January I was out of the country. But because a lot of folks have said that Thursday night is not a great night, we were doing pub theology third Thursday nights. And a lot of people said that that's just not a great night for them, or that there's other kind of things in conflict. So we're going to change it to third Tuesday nights, pub theology. I'll send out like a email about this, and we'll get it out in the e-blast and everything. What? No?
I have book club that night.
Third Tuesday night.
We're going to need to get a sitter or 40.
We'll figure that out. Yeah. But anyway, that's yeah. We'll work it out. Yeah. Anyway, so sorry. Maybe we'll have to change to a different night. We'll have an announcement next week about pub theology. Yeah. So thank you for bringing me that. Okay. Keep your eye out for news about what we're doing next. It could be fourth Tuesday night. Yeah. Okay, fourth Tuesday night it might be in the spring. Okay, so preliminary suggestion of fourth Tuesday night. I'll be able to send out a reading with the e-blast with Shay next time it comes out. But also I'll print them out next week. I'll have copies of the reading for next pub theology night. Something that everyone's welcome to. It'll be 7 o'clock about it in Marley, and we'll get like the big table reserved in the back, and folks can just come hang out, talk about theology, and read along with us if you like, or maybe just order some fish and chips and a beer. But whatever you like is good. But okay, well, thanks so much for letting me know about that, Catherine. And
And we meet at the Marley, so we already have that table reserved.
How about your book club becomes a pub theology book club? Sounds good. So, this is communication. Right. Well, so our topic for the semester is resurrection. We got to speak last week about kind of general, broad terms about the resurrection in Christian theology. And today we're talking particularly about the Old Testament and ancient Israel and the ancient Near East more broadly. So, was something like a resurrection in the ancient world before Christianity? So, in any event, this will be our topic for today. Next week we'll talk about the New Testament. So, what does resurrection look like after the advent of Greek thought, sort of coming in contact with Jewish thought? But also in the New Testament, and even we'll talk a little bit about beyond into the era of the early church. What does resurrection look like then? So we'll have to take a break then after that because it's Ash Wednesday, and then we'll be in Lent. We have a series that I think dovetails with our series on resurrection, and that's about sin and death. So we'll talk about that, the death and resurrection of Christ in just about every theological system has to deal with the question of sin, simply because that's something the New Testament ties in with the question of Jesus' death and resurrection pretty closely. So after that season of Lent, with our discussion about sin, which will be kind of an all-call, Sharon and Benno and Shirley and I will all take turns presenting and sometimes present together on that topic. And after the Easter season, after Easter, when we're in the Easter season, we'll come back to the question of resurrection. Talk about the early church and then into the contemporary world. We've had one request to talk about resurrection in other religions, so we'll talk about that at the end of the semester as well, in early May. Other thoughts or comments? Please feel free to let me know, or if you look at the syllabus and you're like there's something missing, like resurrection in relation to other religions, please just let me know. All right, so resurrection itself. We talked a little bit last week about the question of it's about life and death. It's not just life, but also it's new life that isn't quite like the life we have right now, and it's not quite just resuscitation. That there's this kind of difference there, and it has to do something with Jesus and with sin and with death. But in the ancient world, ancient world, like in ancient Mesopotamia, and again, the ancient Israelites were folks who were from the ancient Near East. They're sort of cousins of the ancient Mesopotamians and the ancient Egyptians, and that was the cultural milieu in which the Old Testament emerges. They didn't really think that much about the afterlife. They thought some. I mean, in ancient Egypt, they thought a lot about the afterlife, actually, but most people in the ancient Near East didn't think that much about the afterlife. And in ancient Israel, we read the Old Testament, we see it's just not that big an idea. And in everywhere except for ancient Egypt, there wasn't much an attempt to synthesize ideas about the ancient Near East, or come up with like a big philosophical idea that was consistent or coherent. There were some kind of ideas here and there that are kind of scattered around in the Old Testament, in ancient Mesopotamia, and so on, but they don't kind of form a coherent whole. And it seems that no one really sat down and thought, well, I got to make sense of the afterlife. It was a bit of a mystery. This right here, you can see this is a cylinder seal. Folks in the ancient Near East would have a little picture carved onto a cylinder of stone, and they would actually wear it like a necklace around their neck. And this was their signature, and everyone's was unique. So if I rolled this out on a clay tablet, it was like my signature. This is how I'd sign a document, like a property tax or document. Yes, I paid my property tax, and I rolled out this, and then everyone knows that I signed it. This is like Brennan Feb, right? So every image was different, and a lot of images were just geometric shapes and things like this, but some were actually pictures of things. And we think, we're not exactly sure, it doesn't say this is Gilgamesh and Enkidu, but we think this is something like Gilgamesh and Enkidu subduing the bull of heaven. This is part of the ancient epic of Gilgamesh. Well, I put this up here because there's a big part of the Gilgamesh story that's quite interesting to us, and it tells us a little bit about death in the ancient Mesopotamia. Gilgamesh's friend Enkidu dies. So this is probably Gilgamesh and Enkidu, his kind of crazy friend who's given to him in order to kind of make Gilgamesh have a buddy. So he didn't go on a buddy adventure. They subdue the bull of heaven, who was like terrorizing the earth. There's all sorts of other adventures they go on, and then Enkidu dies. And when Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh goes on a quest for immortality. That's most of the story of Gilgamesh. It's actually a pretty cool story if you haven't ever read Gilgamesh. It's one of the most ancient stories we have, and it's actually pretty neat. So the whole thing is that he's a human trying to find immortality because he's troubled by his friend's death. And in one of the versions, there's actually lots of different versions of Gilgamesh. It's like kind of like fan fiction in the ancient world. There's little stories here and there that pop up with Gilgamesh. And one of the stories that actually doesn't become part of the canon of Gilgamesh literature, but is kind of a fanfic that didn't make it into the story. But we have some copies of. Gilgamesh's friend Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh is able to kind of talk to him in the world beyond. He's like, "What's it like down there, Enkidu?" And Enkidu says, "It kind of stinks, man. I'm so sorry. Like, life is really kind of boring. We just sit there like dead bodies, and like we kind of like chirp like birds, and then we grow like some feathers, and it's all dusty." And Gilgamesh says, "Oh man, I really want immortal life." So Gilgamesh knows that the gods have immortal life, and he says, "I want that." So he goes on a quest to try to find it, and he gets this herb or it's like a flower really, that has like immortality properties or something like that. And there's a snake that grabs it and runs away, so he doesn't actually get to eat it. And while he's snake, yeah. So while he's kind of like, it sounds like the disruption of the serpent and with Adam and Eve and the sort of tree of life. So they don't eat from the tree of life, but they eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil instead, and are kicked out of the garden. So anyway, this kind of like disruption between humans and immortality occurs in Gilgamesh as well. And Gilgamesh is really upset by this, but then he kind of sits down to get a beer with the alewife Siduri, who runs kind of the alehouse at the end of the world, right on the edge of the world of death. And she sits him down, pours him a beer, and she says, "Gilgamesh, just enjoy your life. Stop going on these quests for immortality. You're a human, so just enjoy humanity. Be a real human and just forget about afterlife." And he actually even meets a guy who saved the earth from a flood and Ziusudra, and so he meets Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh says, "Hey, you got immortality. You're the one person who's ever gotten immortality. What's it like?" And he's like, "It kind of stinks actually. It's not that great. I just kind of hang out in this little area by myself and forever, and it's not very fun." So Gilgamesh says, "Oh, shoot." So Gilgamesh just enjoys his life. And that seems to kind of sum up ancient Mesopotamian conceptions of the death and the afterlife. Don't worry about it too much. Live your life instead. The afterlife is probably going to be you sitting in some motionless place, like not having fun. Even if you have immortality, it just isn't that fun. Sorry. Have fun on Earth instead. So ancient Egypt seems to be a little bit different than this. Ancient Egyptians think a lot about death, or at least the elite think a lot about death and afterlife. There's a lot of crazy theories about this, but of course mummification is a big part of Egyptian culture, and they preserve the bodies for the afterlife. There are some folks who think ancient Egyptians, before even there were kings and so on, would bury the dead out in the sands, the hot sands, kind of outside of the Nile Valley. And after a while, if the sands kind of blow away, the sands are hot and dry, and so it mummifies, this natural mummification. So people would like wander up in these sand areas and it's like see bodies uncovered by the wind blowing sands and so on, and be like, "Wow, that body's preserved." maybe there's an afterlife, whatever. That's one of the ways people think about how this process begins of Egyptian obsession with death and the afterlife. This is from the Book of the Dead. This is one of the images of the weighing of the heart ceremony to see if your heart is heavier or lighter than ma'at, which is like wisdom and justice and goodness and so on. So in other words, how good were did you live your life according to the principles of goodness and justice and peace and so on? And if you did, if you made the world a better place or whatever, more in balance with your life, then you'd get sort of to visit the world beyond, the eternal life that was blessed and happy. It seems really that this is aimed more at the elite. This is like what kings get, because you have to prepare for the ceremony and you have to memorize this Book of the Dead. And there's all sorts of stuff you have to kind of do to have a blessed afterlife. Like you have to have a nice grave with all sorts of figurines that would come alive and work for you in the afterlife called shabtis. Anyway, there's a lot of preparations you have to do. King Tut's tomb. You ever see pictures of King Tut's tomb? And he's there's all sorts of stuff in that tomb that's for him to use in the afterlife. Now, if you were a common peasant, they're just buried in shallow graves. They don't have nice tombs. They don't get embalmed in the same way. So they just kind of go die. So anyway, it looks like this is, not everyone gets to enjoy the blessed beatific afterlife that the pharaohs and the elite would get to enjoy. But nonetheless, they thought that there was a possibility of beatific afterlife just for some people. This is sort of an ancient Near Eastern image of the world. Now, different people would have had different ways of actually picturing it, but when you put together the literature and the information that we have, this is probably the best you can get at a picture of what the ancients actually thought the world looked like. So, the world is like a big plate that is protected by a bowl called the firmament. If you read Genesis 1, God makes a firmament. That word is really, rakia just means bowl. So God took a bowl, turned it upside down, and sunk it down into water. The world before the earth was created was just a bunch of water. And God takes a bowl and sinks it down in the water. And if you've ever done this before, take a bowl, put it upside down, sink it in water, what do you create? A vacuum, an air bubble, right? You get an air bubble. So there's an air bubble here, that's the earth. And there's a plate down here that's kind of holding the air bubble together that we stand on. So we're in the midst of an air bubble. And what's all around us in the cosmos is water. Why do they think this? Because it rains. Where does that water come from? From the waters above, and it's blue above, right? It looks like an ocean above us, right? So there are these little holes up here where the rain comes from, and in Noah's Ark, the whole story of the flood of the earth, what God does is pokes big holes in the firmament and lets the big chaos waters that are being held up by the bowl kind of come down and flood the earth, and then God drains them out of the bottom after the flood and creates the air bubble again. So in any event, this is the way people picture the earth. There are these big mountains at the edges of the earth that kind of hold up the bowl. And that's kind of a sacred space. The very edges of the earth, these big mountains that kind of hold up the pillars of the earth, and the gods kind of hang out up there. Mount Sinai is one of these mountains out in the middle of nowhere that holds up the edges of the earth. And the Greeks have this idea too, that there's these pillars of the earth at the edges of the earth and so on. So here's where we live, kind of in the middle of the earth. And here's these big seas all around us. We live in the dry land here, and underneath us, there's the great deep, the kind of ocean underneath us, and the foundations of the earth that hold up the plate. And then there's this area kind of underneath us called Sheol. And this is the Hebrew word for this land. There are other words in other ancient Eastern languages for this kind of pit underneath the earth, but it's the pit. It's where the dead body, when you bury someone, they kind of go down to the pit. They just hang out down there. And so if you read stuff about Sheol in the Bible, and there is stuff about Sheol in the Bible, it's just this place where people go after they die, and sorry, it's not fun. It's just, you just sit there and you just lay there and you're done. You don't talk much, this is at least the general conception of Sheol. Here, let me show you a little close up here. So Sheol's not fun. So live your life, right? If you are not having a good time in your life, you need to try to figure out how to have a better time in life, because that's it. And that's it.
So Brennan, you say it's not fun. Is it unfun?
This is a point of contention. It can sound like it's unfun sometimes. There are depictions of it where it's brutal almost. It's a place of deprivation. And then there's places where it's just everyone's sleeping. And then there's even some depictions of it where people are actually in different parts of it. There's parts for the bad people, and there's parts for the good people, and the bad people have they fight with each other. It's they get in wars with each other. And then the nice people kind of live in peace together, but just kind of sleeping next to each other. It's rest in peace. They're just resting in peace. Or you're resting in conflict. And there seems to even be a little a way of talking about if you go down to Sheol troubled in this life, that you kind of carry that trouble with you for the rest of time. Or if you go down in peace, this is why it's such a big deal to die in peace in the Old Testament. You can actually go down and enjoy that rest in peace forever, especially if your life is kind of in harmony. And if there's ancestors that you have before you and people who are following after you who kind of carry you on into the world, into the hereafter, or into history. There's an example here. So in the book of Genesis, there's a couple of times, let me just read this one bit about Jacob's death. So in Genesis chapter 49, and if you have a Bible, you can open up and see this part. There's different translations, of course, in the different Bibles, which might be helpful sometimes, especially in language about death. So Genesis chapter 49, verse 29. This is an easy one. First book of the Bible, right? Come on. Genesis 49, verse 29. So Jacob is about to die. He blesses in Genesis chapter 48, 49. Jacob blesses his children, the 12 tribes. And so then he gathers these kids together. And he says to them, verse 29, I'm about to be gathered to my people. He's about to die, but the way he talks about dying is being gathered to his people. So he gets to have a goodbye with his 12 children and 2 of them grandchildren, whatever, children of Joseph. He gets his family together, and his family gets to say goodbye to him, and he gets to bless them, and he gets to pray with them. And then he says, I'm about to be gathered to my people. So he's going to be kind of buried with his family in the same family plot. That's a big deal in the ancient world, to be in the family plot. Bury me with my ancestors in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave in the field at Machpelah near Mamre in the land of Canaan, in the field that Abraham bought from Ephron the Hittite as a burial site. It's kind of an interesting part of the book of Genesis. There are big promises in Genesis, starting with Genesis 12 to Abraham and his family, Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, and so on. Hagar, of course, and Ishmael get some slightly different promises. But the promise of the family is that they're going to get a name, they're going to be turned into a big nation, they're going to get some land, actually a lot of land. The land of Canaan is going to be theirs. This family that gets this promise and kind of lives for 3 generations in this land as a wanderer, and the only land they actually have at the end of their 3 generations to show for it is a tiny cave. They don't own any property in this land that they've been promised 3 generations later. So in any event, the promises take a long time to get worked out. But it gives Abraham and Joseph and Jacob a lot of great comfort that they have this little piece of land, and if they can own one thing, it's going to be a graveyard for their family. So go to that cave of Machpelah in Canaan that we bought as a burial site. Verse 31, then there Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. There Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried. And there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is in it were purchased from the Hittites, these folks who lived in the area. When Jacob ended his charge to his sons, he drew his feet into the bed, drew his feet up into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. This is a vision of a good death. Right, your family around you, you know where you're going to be buried, you can kind of rest in comfort that things will go on after you and you'll be remembered. So part of the burial thing is they actually kept up these burial sites, and they sometimes have inscriptions with names on it or whatever, ways to remember you, but also they would take care of the site, sometimes even pouring libations, drink offerings down there and so on, just in case you can drink something down there in the land of the dead, let me give you a little bit of beer, right? A little bit of wine to take off the edge of the afterlife. But anyway, but this is a happy death. So this is going down to the land of the dead, and you're going to rest in peace, and you're going to be fine. No one's worrying about Jacob here. He's lived a very good life. Now there's a different story in the book of Genesis that depicts a slightly different potential afterlife. It turns out to not be true. But if you turn to Genesis chapter 37. Yeah, Genesis chapter 37, verse 35. So just to back a few pages. This is when Jacob thinks that his son Joseph has been killed. Joseph's brothers, remember Joseph's coat of many colors. It's actually a coat with long sleeves. It's a bad translation of many colors. Sorry to anyway. But he has this nice coat, and the brothers get jealous. They kill him so they can take the coat, and also to get rid of the father's, affection for one child over the others. And they actually don't kill him. They actually end up selling him into slavery. And then they take the coat and they kind of get it mauled by a lion. They put blood on it and so on. And so then they kind of tear it up as if it had been mauled like a lion. And then they show it to Jacob, and Jacob thinks his son Joseph has been killed at a young age.
Sorry to interrupt you, Brennan.
Yes.
Did you just say that the coat of many colors was actually not many
Sorry,
colors?
yeah, it's a
It's
bad
a coat of
translation. Yeah, the word in Hebrew does not mean many colors.
Long sleeves.
It means long sleeve tunic. Yeah, big long sleeves. It's got a lot of fabric on it. It's a lavish tunic, right? Coat of many colors comes from the Greek translation, which like they didn't really have to do with the long sleeve bit, and they just kind of put many colors in it. So anyway, so you can think of it if you like that way. It's fine. But
It
anyway.
might have been colorful.
They don't say anything
Don't
about it.
take that away from me.
I don't know how many. It doesn't say how many colors it had.
I respectfully push back.
And it is your right to do so. That's right. So this coat of many colors, which also had long sleeves. Verse 33 of Genesis 37. Jacob recognizes this and he says, "That's my son's robe. Like I gave that to him, right? A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without a doubt torn to pieces." He's not actually, but Jacob thinks he is. Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son for many days. In other words, he does these ritual acts of mourning where you make yourself look like you've been beat up. In other words, it's like you show on the outside how you feel on the inside. You tear up your clothes. You put ashes on your face to make yourself look dirty, and you kind of make yourself look bad. All his sons and his daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son." Thus his father bewailed him. So notice the difference in language there between like the whole gathered to the ancestors, like, "Oh, I'm being gathered to my ancestors, it's great, let me bless you and pray with you," and then he was gathered, like, "Please bury me in the place," and he got buried and he goes to the ancestors. I mean, it's like 2 chapters later that he's actually dying and he's happy. Here he's unhappy and he's about to die, and he starts to talk about Sheol and how he's going to be dragged down there after his son, and he's always going to be mourning forever. So in other words, the kind of life that you live on earth, like the reverberations of that kind of go into the afterlife. That seems to be the way ancient folks tended to think about the afterlife. So here's another image from Marc Chagall of David mourning for his son Absalom. Here's Absalom hanging up in a tree. Absalom rebelled against David in the book of 2 Samuel, and David doesn't want Absalom to die, even though he's a rebel. He's trying to literally kill his father and take over his kingdom. But David says, "Please don't," tells his soldiers, "don't kill Absalom," but they do. So here he is mourning. Absalom died in terrible circumstances, and David is worried that he's going to be going down to Sheol in mourning, and that he's going to have to go down to Sheol in mourning, and so on. So this kind of worry about the state you're in when you die seems to be pretty important. So there's a couple of people who, at least in the traditions of Judaism and Christianity, might break this mold. What about Enoch and Elijah? So in Genesis chapter 4, it says like God kind of takes Enoch up to heaven, and then he just was no more. And then in the book of Kings, Elijah gets taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, 2 Kings 2, and he kind of like is in a chariot going up to heaven and so on, and then he was no more. What happened to these folks? In the Old Testament, it doesn't actually talk about them again. It doesn't really talk about, Elijah's mentioned in Malachi as like a symbol, but it's not really like people go walk around thinking that's I want that to happen to me. Like no one ever asks to be taken up to heaven in a fiery chariot. And in fact, the language that's used in both of those, God took this person and they were no more, sounds a lot like death. It's actually the language that you use. Those are the precise words you use for death. So like what happens to them, like no one knows. Like in the Old Testament, they don't actually think about it or talk about it. There's not a lot of meditation on this. It's not ever lifted up as a goal. I want to be taken up into heaven by God. Later on in Christian and Jewish tradition, once there's a conception of like a beatific, a nice afterlife, these folks are assumed to have kind of gone there without dying. But in any event, it's unclear if you just look at the Old Testament by itself what these ancient authors actually thought about this. There's a couple of stories that have to do with what's oftentimes in Christian tradition talked about as resurrection. And one of these is in 1 Kings. So if you have your Bibles and want to open up to 1 Kings, if you kind of think about the Bible as the Old Testament as kind of like chunks of material, you have the Torah, the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then after that, you have what we call the Deuteronomistic history. So this history of Israel that kind of is built on the theology of Deuteronomy. And those books like Joshua and Judges, and then 1st and 2nd Samuel, and then 1st and 2nd Kings. I'm skipping Ruth because she sticks out a little bit. She's an insertion into this, and an excellent insertion into this male-dominated violent story. But anyway, so this story in 1st, 2nd Samuel and then 1st, 2nd Kings is kind of like the rise of kings. That's the story of David is in 1st, 2nd Samuel, and the story of all the kings of Israel. So if you look at 1 Kings 17, 1 Kings 17 is kind of an interruption in the story that's mainly dominated by these kings of Israel, and we get this character named Elijah who kind of bursts onto the scene. And Elijah, we talk about him as a prophet, and he is described as a prophet a few times, but the name that actually applies to him most often is man of God. Ish Elohim in Hebrew, a man of God, which isn't like a regular prophet. It's kind of its own subset of prophet. So we think of a prophet as like someone who like is able to kind of keenly observe the environment, gets a message from God, is able to kind of pronounce like what's going to happen in the near-term future. That's kind of what we think of prophets as. Elijah doesn't do a whole lot of that. Elijah just kind of like brings God's power into particular situations. It's almost like a portal, a divine portal to God's power. And Elisha is like this too. So he does these things, like Isaiah never brings any kid back to life. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, they don't bring kids back to life because they're not conduits of like amazing divine power. They just know some stuff. But Elisha and Elijah have this ability to do stuff, miracles. And this is why when Jesus is depicted in the New Testament as a miracle worker, the miracles are the same ones that Elisha and Elijah did. In other words, like it's the same God, it's the same power. Jesus is a portal to God's power, just like these ancient folks were too. So Elijah and Elisha have miracles of feeding. They make extra food. And in fact, there's one time in 2 Kings, the first few chapters of 2 Kings, actually 2 Kings 4, I think, where Elisha takes some bread, just a few loaves of bread, and breaks it apart and feeds several thousand people with it. I don't know if you've heard a story like that before. Yeah. Or there are several times where Elisha and Elijah raise children from the dead, which is what Jesus does. So in any event, with Jesus' miracles aren't like coming out of nowhere. They're signs, they're symbols that Jesus' power is the same power that the people have been waiting for to come back. So it's an ancient power. So in any event, one of these miracles is the raising of the widow's son. So in 1 Kings 17, chapter 17, verse 17, you read this message. After the son of this woman, so Elijah goes to a foreign land, to the Phoenicians, and creates a miracle of food. There's a drought, and there's no food, and he finds a widow, and he tells her, if you bake me a loaf of bread, you'll have unending oil. And she does it, and there's a miracle of food. Well, this same woman who has a son, and they're widowed, so there's no father around, this woman is depending on her son to take care of her in her old age. After the son of this woman, the mistress of the house, became ill. His illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him, so the kid died. She then said to Elijah, "What have you against me, O man of God?" There's that man of God title, like the Ish Elohim. Like, you're a miracle worker, but why did you do this to me? Why did you kill my kid? You have come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and cause the death of my son. So you're judging me, aren't you? But he said, "Give me your son." And he took him from her bosom, carried him up into the upper chamber where he was lodging, and laid him on his own bed. And he cried out to Yahweh, the God, Lord, "O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I'm staying by killing her son?" Now notice that Elijah doesn't say like, "Oh God, you're so amazing, you're so wonderful." Elijah yells at God for doing this and gets mad, which I love it. The Old Testament doesn't tell us to like just be nice to God. If something happens that you're upset with, let God have it. Because a lot of times God says, I'm sorry, okay. And right here, God says, okay, verse 21, he stretched himself upon the child and said, "O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." And the Lord listened to the voice of Elijah. And the life of the child came into him again, and he was revived. Elijah took the child, brought him down, gave him to his mother, and Elijah said, "See, your son's alive." And then the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, Ish Elohim. Now I know you're a miracle worker, that the word of Yahweh in your mouth is truth." So in any event, this story is one that Christians have oftentimes pointed to in like resurrection. Like this is resurrection. But the kid's going to die again someday. He's just alive for now. So it's a resuscitation is another way to talk about this. If you want to use the word resurrection, that's fine, but then we have to use some other word to talk about what Christians generally talk about, which is something that happens after death, that you don't die again. There's a transformation that happens, not just a resuscitation or a revivification. And there's another story in the Old Testament that gets used a lot to talk about resurrection, and I think does talk about resurrection in a way, but it's, again, slightly different than how Christians oftentimes interpret it. When we get to talk about the New Testament, I'll talk about ways that the early Christians look at the Old Testament and try to understand it, that can help us make sense of why these things sometimes don't say the same thing we think they say when we read them in the context of the Old Testament, the ancient world. So if you turn with me to Ezekiel, so if you kind of flip a bunch after 1 Kings, and you go past Psalms and Proverbs and so on, go past Isaiah, you'll past Jeremiah, you can find Ezekiel. In Ezekiel chapter 37, This is a chapter you all know because it's about dem bones. Dem bones. Dem dry bones. This, by the way, is the earliest picture we have of the Valley of Dry Bones. This is from a Jewish synagogue, which oftentimes don't have depictions of images, but in this synagogue they did from the 3rd century AD in Dura Europos. So here's Ezekiel receiving a message from God about these kind of dead bodies, and here is God's spirit depicted as a psyche, like a fairy almost in Greek culture, and is breathing new life into them, and then they're all restored again. So anyway, this is the story of Ezekiel 37. And we can read it here. The hand of Yahweh came upon me, that is the power of God came upon me, power of the Lord came upon me. And God brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me down in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. So Ezekiel is having this vision in the time of the exile. Israel as a nation has been destroyed. Judah, the southern part of Israel as a nation, has been destroyed. Jerusalem is destroyed. The people have been taken, or at least a chunk of the people have been taken into exile. They're living in Babylon as not slaves. They're living as like kind of indentured servants in Babylon. Okay, so the Ezekiel's having this vision while his whole world has been destroyed. And the people are asking, do we just become Babylonians now? Do we give up on hope of ever going back to our land? Like, what do we do about God? Did God abandon us? Did God reject us? Maybe Yahweh just never existed. Maybe we were just believing fairy tales. I mean, our city was destroyed. I still watched the temple of Yahweh get destroyed. What happened? So Ezekiel is somebody who comes up with and gives theological explanations for what happened in the exile and crafts really a new kind of faith that is the reason that we're Christians and why Jews are Jews today. I mean, it could easily have, there aren't Ammonites living today. There aren't Philistines today. Like, there's no, modern people don't worship the ancient gods of Syria. The reason is because people eventually gave those gods up. And they gave them up because of situations like this, precisely like this. They were defeated, they were destroyed, and they moved on. And there's something about the Jewish people that they didn't ever move on. They couldn't move on. Yahweh had them. And so it's because of people like Jeremiah, people like Ezekiel, that came up with reactions to what had happened, this trauma, this tragedy of the destruction of Jerusalem, that gave people hope to carry on in their faith, in their culture, in their language, in their worship of Yahweh, and to believe that Yahweh actually was going to do something to revive them one day as a people and bring them back home and give them a new hope and a new place. So this is that story. Ezekiel has a vision in exile that God brings him to a valley and it's full of bones, death, destruction. He led me around all of them. There were very, very many lying in the valley, and they were very dry. God said to me, "Mortal, can these bones live?" This is an analogy for Israel. It's destroyed. It's done. It's dead. Can something dead live again? No. Jerusalem's gone. The hope is gone that Yahweh will be with them again.
God addressed that person as mortal?
Yeah. So Ezekiel always gets called mortal. Another way of saying this is son of man. This is exactly, in Hebrew, the phrase is son of man, son of human. This is what Jesus calls himself. So I'll explain this real quick. So Ezekiel is called mortal or son of man to remind him that he's low and God is big. In other words, we don't understand. So Ezekiel's living in a time when everyone's questioning God. Why didn't this work? Why didn't this happen? Ezekiel's reminded again and again, and then reminds the people, we don't know. We don't know everything. Just trust. In times where you can't figure out what's happening, try to remember that you're small and you're never going to understand the whole story. So, anyway, that's kind of part of why he's called mortal. But then in the book of Daniel, which we'll talk about in a little bit, Daniel is told that one day a son of man, using this exact same word, is going to come, chapter 7, and basically save the world. And this is understood to be the people of Israel, the nation of Israel is being revived and come back. So when Jesus uses this imagery, what it means when Jesus calls himself Son of Man, he means I'm going to save, but I'm someone who doesn't look like he's going to save. I'm a surprising Savior, like the ones you've heard about of old. So anyway, mortal, can these bones live? And then Ezekiel says, oh God, you know. I don't know. So then God said to me, prophesy to these bones and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord to these bones, I will cause breath to enter you and you shall live. I will lay sinews on you and I will cause flesh to come upon you and cover you with skin and put breath in you and you shall live and you shall know that I am the Lord. So, Ezekiel says, I prophesied as I had been commanded. And as I prophesied, suddenly there was a noise, a rattling, and the bones came together, bone to its bone. I looked, and there were sinews upon them. Muscle kind of comes on them, right? And flesh had come upon them, and the skin had covered them. But there was no breath in them. Then he said to me, prophesy to the breath, prophecy mortal, and say to the breath, thus says the Lord God. By the way, another word for breath is the Spirit. It's the same word in Hebrew. That's what's being represented here. The Spirit of God is coming and blowing into them, just like in Genesis 2, God blows into the human and turns it on, makes it live, the breath of God. So thus says Lord God, come upon these four winds, O breath, O Spirit, and breathe upon the slain, that they may live. I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came upon them, and they lived. They stood on their feet, a vast multitude. So then he said to me, mortal, these are the bones of the whole house of Israel. So it's like made plain here. This is about Israel, the nation of Israel being revived. They said, our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, we are cut off completely. Therefore prophesy to them. Thus says the Lord God, I'm going to open up your graves and bring you up out of your graves, my people, and I'll bring you back to the land of Israel. And you shall know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and bring you up from your graves, my people. I will put my spirit within you, and you shall live, and I will place you on your own soil. That you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken and will act, says the Lord. So it's a prophecy about what's going to happen in the future. God is going to revive the people, the nation, and bring them back and plant them back in Jerusalem and give them a hope in the future and so on. It's the same thing that Jeremiah says in Jeremiah chapter 29:11. I know, says the Lord, I'm going to give you a hope in the future and so on. So this way of thinking about the corporate resurrection or resuscitation of Israel is also in Hosea, right? Like 3, you've been slain and I'm going to make you live again in Hosea 6. These are pretty clearly about the people of Israel and the nation of Israel. But at the same time, there's something in it that, a kernel of this idea that God is something that has power over death and life. And God can bring new life out of death. So in other words, a lot of people will read these texts and be like, it has nothing to do with resurrection. I don't say that because, if you read the story about dead bones coming back to life and getting skin on them and giving new life, it's a metaphor for the people of Israel, but at the same time, it's a pretty powerful image that has to do with God taking death and turning life out of it. So in other words, I think there's a kernel of what we come across in Christian ideas about resurrection, even in these ancient texts. We don't read about this kind of stuff in, say, ancient Babylonian literature, at least that I know of. After the exile, there's a time where the nation actually is restored. Ezekiel's prophecy comes true. This is why we have a book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel said stuff that came true. People wrote it down. They continued to read it because it came true. At least in their interpretation, it came true. After a long time, there's sort of a period of subjugation to the Persian Empire, where Jews come into contact with ideas from Persia, including dualism, that there's a radical evil power and a radically good power, and they're kind of fighting with each other. Ancient Israelite ideas are basically like Yahweh is Lord of death and life. But there's this idea that they keep coming in contact with it. Maybe there's actually two powers, a good power and an evil power. And this would actually explain a lot, because if God is just God alone and there's no evil power in the world, which is kind of how the Old Testament sounds a lot of the time, then why does bad stuff happen? The Old Testament oftentimes says it's because of us. We do the bad stuff. But what about that bad stuff that it seems like people don't do, like earthquakes or whatever? There's a lot of bad stuff out there that I don't want to make responsible, say a person's responsible for. So this idea over time that gets into Judaism, which is that there may be an evil power that is fighting against God, starts to kind of influence the theology of ancient Israel. And someday I'll talk about apocalyptic theology and get more into detail and explain more of how this transition actually works. But for now, here's what happens. This is the short course in apocalyptic theology. There's a sense of this, we've already read about kind of the resuscitation of a nation and things like this. God acts decisively in history. That's something that ancient Israelites believe. At the same time, they believe that over time there's this transition to a belief that there is going to be a radical intervention of God into the world, a break of the world's history. In other words, the Jewish people keep getting kicked around by all these other nations and powers, and they keep thinking God's going to help us, and God helps a little bit, and God helps a little bit. God restores them, but then they get taken over again. Eventually, there's a point where they start saying there's going to be someday an intervention by God that isn't temporary, that is eternal. God's going to fix the things that are wrong with the world. And this really comes into fruition in the book of Daniel, which is the last parts of Daniel are the last stuff that's written in what we have in most of our Old Testaments, unless you consider Ben Sira, but actually Daniel's after Ben Sira. Yeah, so anyway, it's the last stuff that's written in the Bible. So you turn with me to Daniel, which if you're in Ezekiel, just keep turning a little bit and you'll get to Daniel. Daniel chapter 12, the last bit of the book of Daniel. So the story of the book of Daniel basically is the first 6 chapters are like Daniel kind of in exile, being tested by kings and so on. The question is like, who's sovereign? Is God sovereign, or are the kings that dominate us sovereign, and so on? Daniel chapter 7 starts a big shift towards apocalyptic theology. Something happens in between Daniel chapter 6 and Daniel chapter 7, where it's no longer cute stories about the lion's den and Daniel like surviving in difficult situations. And now it's like chaos monsters are coming onto the earth, and like God is smiting them, and like it's just like it gets crazy in Daniel chapter 7, all the way to Daniel chapter 12. And we think these relate to a particular moment in time, actually the year 167 BC. So in 167 BC, the Greek king, kind of in the line of Alexander the Great, who ruled over this territory, decided to persecute the Jewish religion. First ever time in the history of the world that anyone decides to persecute a religion, not just a people. We don't know exactly why this happened. Again, I think next year we'll talk about apocalyptic theology a bit more, and I'll have time to kind of explain the details of this and so on. If you're interested, I teach a class in the book of Daniel where we have a long time to talk about apocalyptic theology. But anyway, for the sake of this purpose, this class, there's a Greek king named Antiochus IV who has an idea because he thinks that the religion itself probably is causing the Jewish people to revolt again and again. He says the problem is the religion. I got to take that away. So he starts to persecute people who have copies of the Torah. He actually burns the copies of the Torah that he can find, but also he tells his henchmen to like kill people who have it. So you got to get rid of it. Also, circumcision is like a mark of being Jewish. So if mothers have children who are circumcised, he kills both of them. He pushes the mother and child off the wall. So there's a persecution of a religion that seems to be just heartless. And the Jewish people at the time begin to think, God's not behind this. Like we used to, God's behind a lot of things in the world that are challenging to us, judgment. This isn't judgment anymore. This is an evil power trying to eradicate our faith in God. So they start to say, this is that evil power we've been hearing about. We see it now. It's manifesting in this person, but it's bigger than a person. It's not just like one man's heart. It's like the power of evil in the world. And then they start to say, we can't beat this. We have to ask God to get involved. So they start to wait for this moment of like, God's inbreaking into the world. And theology, the end of time, begins to kind of take hold in the book of Daniel, which is a meditation on this end. Like, what is God ever going to actually take care of the evil we see in the world, not just in human hearts, but beyond it? So, in any event, this is a big topic of conversation in Jesus' day. This is why we read about demons and things in the New Testament. This is because this apocalyptic theology of the evil power and God's intervention in the world this is where it comes in. So, Daniel 12 is a vision of the last day. And it's the only time in the Old Testament where we actually see a discussion of like a physical resurrection or something like a physical resurrection. Maybe it might not even be a physical resurrection. It's a bit hard to say. But this is what it says. So, at the end, after God fights this evil power and destroys it, verse 12, at that time Michael, the great prince, anyone know what Michael they're talking about? You ever been in Paris? You see Saint Michel, you see this big knight stabbing a dragon in the throat with a spear. So this is Michael the archangel who fights against the devil. This is where this comes from. Because of Daniel, this is the earliest time we see a named angel in the Bible as well. It's in the book of Daniel, chapter 7 through 12. The angels didn't have names before this. They were just messengers of God, like lowly divine messengers. Now we start to have these names for angels, but Michael means like who is like God. So in other words, Michael, the name is even trying to say like, don't worship these things. We're just messengers from God. But still. So at that time, Michael, the great prince of the angels, the protector of your people, shall arise. There shall be a time of anguish, such as has never occurred since nations came into existence. But at that time, your people shall be delivered. Everyone who is found written in the book of life. This is where that idea comes from. That there's some sort of book, and like the people who have been faithful during this time of persecution will be in the book. And then there's like, if your name's not in there, like, sorry, naughty nice list, like, Santa, right? This is where all that comes from. Not kidding.
How many people are in the book?
It doesn't.
Do you have an idea?
It doesn't say. So it's like it's a bit coy about that. But in Revelation, there are some numbers given. But that's early Christian apocalyptic. But
Jehovah's Witnesses get their thing, where it's like a sort of number.
Comes from Revelation, 144,000. Yeah.
Right.
Those are the sort of,
I've heard that.
right. So that's from the book of Revelation, which takes Daniel 7 through 12 and thinks about it in a new day and age. Yeah. So in any event, this the people whose names are written in the book. Something's going to happen to them. Verse 2, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. This is resurrection. So God's going to take dead people and raise them up, and many of them who sleep in the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So many, but not all. So lots of people are going to get raised up, some to shame and contempt, and some to everlasting life. There's your judgment. So there's going to be a final judgment. And I think the reason this comes about is because if you see someone who's lived a faithful life, and a king who is convinced your religion is a bad thing, like pushes this person off of a wall holding her baby, where's the justice? Like I've got to hope that there's some justice beyond this earth, if that person is going to be lifted up and comforted and be rewarded for her faith and so on. Like what, in other words, like what, if that's the end of the story, it's pretty sad. So in any event, this conception, there's got to be something for these folks who have given up all for their faith, beyond just like being remembered in history or something. There's something that's going to be raised up. And then like, what about that guy who like, that Greek king who like lived a wonderful life and like ate nice food every day and had people playing music for him and like got rubbed down with luxurious oils every morning and whatever, he's living a great life, and he decides to kill a bunch of Jewish people and torture them to death and so on, and he just dies. He actually got killed in battle, but whatever. But he lived a great life. What about that guy? Like, where does he get his just desserts? Well, some get raised to everlasting contempt. That guy's going to be held in contempt because the actions, like his actions matter, not just now, but for all time. So those who are wise, there's like another group here. I think it's kind of hard to figure it out, but I think there's like the ones who were wise, that is the ones who knew, who listened and knew and kept telling people, hold on, hang on, it's going to be okay, God's going to get involved. The people who know and who like kind of teach others and so on shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. So some are going to be raised up to like eternal contempt. Some are going to be raised up to eternal life everlasting. A few who like taught everyone and like helped them to know and like trust and faith in the preachers and the teachers and the exhorters and the people that had compassion on those others, the justice fighters. Those folks are going to actually be like raised up even beyond, like they're going to like have like star bodies or whatever, like they're going to be awesome. And they're going to have a great time for their entire hereafter. And then there's some like the middle folks, the okay folks. We don't hear about them. They just hang out. They're in Sheol, and they're okay whenever they're with their ancestors or something like that. They're all right, and they just get to hang out in Sheol for the rest of their days. But you, Daniel, keep the words secret, and the book sealed until the time of the end. Many shall be running back and forth, and evil shall increase. So, anyway, there's more to the book of Daniel than that, but that's the one time where we see this idea that there's going to be some sort of afterlife judgment. Separating of the sheep and the goats is the way that Jesus talks about it, between the folks who've done well and the folks who have not. And that there is going to be some sort of corporeal existence. They're going to be raised up out of the graves. It's not just an immortal soul thing. And in fact, the Jews at this time wouldn't have had that much of an idea of the concept of an immortal soul that's detachable from a body. That's a Greek idea, Plato, right? This kind of immortal soul, it's kind of bound up in the stuff of the body. That just wouldn't have been very prominent or maybe even known at all in Jewish culture at this time. So in any event, by the time we get to Jesus in the New Testament...
Brennan, you
yes.
said it's the one time that there's any discussion of afterlife in the Old Testament?
I think it's the only time where we have a discussion of like resurrection and afterlife in the way that we see it in the New Testament. And it's still not quite like that in the New Testament, but it's on the way. Again, theologies change in response to the changes in culture and so on over time, and this is one of those kind of steps along the progression of how we get to something like Christianity. Is this kind of emergence of an idea of an afterlife, and it comes here in a kind of shadowy form. It's even shadowy in the New Testament. The New Testament doesn't spend a whole lot of time talking about it. We're giving a lot of details. When it does give details, they tend to be like fragmented, and they don't synthesize together well. If there is an afterlife that is nothing like this earth and this life, then, good luck explaining it here, right? So anyway, they just give lots of images that are kind of interesting and suggestive. So there's 164 years between the time that Daniel's talking about and the time of Jesus, or really like 170 years. But anyway, so we have something like a gap there, and in that intervening gap, there is a radical development of this apocalyptic theology. We know about this because of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls have lots of stuff that's written that didn't make it into the Bible, or make it into everyone's Bible, but that talks about these kind of like fights between good and evil, And by the time we get Jesus, get to Jesus, there's a lot of development. So we'll cover some of that next week in terms of how the human body works, how the soul works, but also how the role of evil and the devil and death itself. So, on to resurrection next week.
Just stating the obvious, but in the Jewish theology, they were believing in one who would, or that times would come and everything would be settled and whole, and yet Jesus comes and says in end times, things will be all unsettled and helter-skelter. It's so different.
So different. So that helter-skelter stuff starts in Daniel. So it starts in the Jewish tradition. So in Daniel chapter 7 through 12, you hear that like there's going to be this really tough time right before the end. And before God's decisive intervention in history, things are going to be bad. God's going to allow evil powers to, for some reason, it's not explained why, but God's going to allow evil powers to kind of do their work before the final judgment. As if to say, like, try your worst, and then I'll come stop it. And so that starts in Daniel, so it's at the very end of the Old Testament period. But yeah, in the book of Genesis, you never think anything like this. Or in Psalms, you don't see stuff about like this kind of time of terror. But this, I think it's a response to the repeated Jewish survivals through these times of terror. And eventually they kind of were said, that can't be it, right? It can't be it that like God's just going to eventually come and save us like every once in a while and deliver us only to be dominated again. If that's it, then it's not quite hope-filling, right? So I think that by the time you get to Jesus, by the time you get to early Christianity, everyone, not everyone, but large segments of the Jewish population are convinced that God's work doesn't stop at the day of our own death, and that God's work is not just kind of piecemeal, that God's going to kind of fix little problems here and there, but there will be some kind of reckoning where God sets the world to right. Does that make sense? But it's a development over time, and that Jewish part comes a couple centuries before Jesus, but at the very end of what we consider the Old Testament period. I don't know if that makes sense. Okay.
Is this the basis of some of the fundamentalist belief that if the Jews are united in Israel,
Yes.
that will be the beginning of the end?
Yes, so Daniel chapter 7, chapter 8 and 9, and to a lesser extent 10 through 12, but really it's like the end of chapter 12. There's like these kind of time things, there's a discussion of the temple. Some of this is taken up into the book of Revelation, which is Christian apocalyptic, and some people have been kind of mining these images for centuries, trying to figure out, okay, what is the end? Of course, Jesus tells us we don't know what the end is going to be. Like no one knows the time or the day or the hour, so stop worrying about it, right? Know that God's going to get involved decisively in history at some point, but like don't try to like figure out if it's tomorrow. Live your life. That's kind of what Jesus says, but a lot of people don't read that so seriously, and so get involved in it. I mean, Isaac Newton gave up science near the end of his life and spent the last decades of his life immersed in apocalyptic numerology, trying to figure out what the end day actually was. Isaac Newton, yeah. So he wrote books about it, literally, and was actually made fun of by Voltaire quite a bit, satirized by some of the atheists of the day for it. But nonetheless, it's this became a really huge idea in Christian thought, and today it remains so. So the decision to move the capital of Jerusalem, according to the United States' perception of Israel, the state of Israel, to Jerusalem, the reason that's really big for Trump and his supporters is precisely because they think it's a step towards the end times. And Mike Pence gave a prayer in Israel and referenced this idea. I mean, this is alive and well.
His supporters, but
Well, so
I don't think he has that belief.
Oh, Trump. Oh, I don't think Trump cares at all. Right, but Trump is doing it because he knows that they care, and they care because that is a lot of evangelical supporters care about this movement of the. It's not even going to happen. I don't think it's just a symbolic move, really. And the reason that they care about it is that it accords with their theologies of the end. From reading Daniel, from reading Daniel 9. And this time in the temple, yeah.
So then the Jews have to have their stuff sorted out, and then the Christians get to get buffed up.
So the way Christian apocalyptic works is that the Jews all die.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, that's the way Christian
They could all
conservative
die.
Christian apocalyptic. Yeah, the way conservative Christian apocalyptic works is that there's some sort of like time of destruction of Israel and Jerusalem in a war, and then Jesus comes back and saves the Christians. So ultimately, the Jewish state knows this. They know that the reason Mike Pence likes Israel is because he wants it to get destroyed. But their argument is, in the meantime, it's better for them politically to have a party in power that supports them, even if it's in light of their long-term destruction.
Okay,
Yeah.
that'll
Stuff.
give you something to ponder.
Yeah, that'll give you something to ponder. So anyway, see you next week. Yeah.